Welcome to Power Your Story, a podcast brought to you by Chicago High School students. After School Matters in the Creative Imposter Studios.
Hey, it's Power Your Story Program Director Andrea Klunder letting you know that this episode is a brilliant interview from our archives with journalist, filmmaker, writer, coach, and educator. Seriously, is there anything she can't do? Ava Thompson Greenwell, that we recorded a couple of years ago following the isolation of the COVID-19 pandemic and the tragedy of the murder of George Floyd in the United States, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement that rose up in the aftermath of that event. We invited Ava to talk with us about her documentary, Mandela in Chicago, after we had a chance to screen it as part of our podcasting program. Here's a little bit about her background. Ava Thompson Greenwell teaches reporting classes at Northwestern University, Medill School of Journalism, Media, Integrated Marketing Communications. In addition to her classroom duties, she has held several administrative posts, including Associate Dean for Curriculum, Director of the Teaching Television Program, co-curator for the nationally recognized Ida B. Wells Award, and director of the McCormick Tribune Fellows Program. The Chicago native is director and producer of Mandela in Chicago, a documentary film about the city's anti-apartheid movement. She is also author of Ladies Leading, The Black Women Who Control Television News. Greenwell, an academic life coach, has been a freelance correspondent for WGN-TV and Chicago Tonight. And in 2024, Ava was named Educator of the Year by NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists. We are so pleased to finally share this interview with you, which continues to resonate even now. This episode was originally produced by Angel, Adrian, Dolores, Jonathan, Leo, Frederick, and David. And you can watch Mandela in Chicago right now on YouTube, thanks to the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. The link is in the show notes in the episode's description in your app and at poweryourstorypodcast.com. We also just learned that Ava is wrapping up another documentary, Hearing Silences, 50 Years of Black Women Faculty at Northwestern. Screenings will be in February 2025. Here's our interview.
Ava Thompson Greenwell, welcome to Power Your Story podcast. My name is Angel. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about you, Angel?
I'm doing good.
Great.
Tell me a little bit about your background and working that you do.
Sure. So I am a native Chicagoan. I grew up on the south side of the city around 75th and Calumet. And I was actually just over there yesterday getting me some Lim's barbecue. So that's one of my favorite stops, is to get my barbecue. I grew up with my mother stopping after work. She worked for Social Security downtown Chicago. And so on a Friday, that was, sort of our fun thing, is to get some Lim's barbecue. So I don't know if you know that place, but it's been around for, I think, more than 50 years. And so it's great to see a Black business that's still in business. So grew up on the South Side. I went to elementary school, Ruggles Elementary School. I went to Whitney Young High School. By the way, I went to the same high school that Michelle Obama went to. She was a class behind me, and we both were in chorus, different periods. I was in girls' chorus, and I would see her coming down the steps to the arts side after my class period. And I can't say that we were good friends, but we know of each other. Let's put it that way. And we have some mutual friends. So I always like to say that when I talk about Whitney Young. After Whitney Young, I went to Northwestern University as an undergrad and actually majored in journalism. And one of the reasons that I went to that school is because, number one, it was close to home. But number two, they had a reputation of having one of the best journalism schools in the country. After that, I stayed on for an extra year to get the master's degree. Then I went out and started working as a television news reporter in Evansville, Indiana, which is about 6 hours south of Chicago. And then I left there and went to work as a reporter in Minneapolis at WCCO TV. And then after that, I worked at WFLA TV in Tampa, Florida. So I've lived in Minnesota, Indiana, Kentucky, because the station was actually located in Kentucky, Florida, and then back to Illinois. So I've spent most of my time at Northwestern, almost 30 years, teaching students how to do what I did as a reporter in the field.
What have you been doing during the paramedic, and did you get new hobbies in past year?
Okay. So during the pandemic, I actually feel like I've worked harder during the pandemic than I've ever worked, in part because I was working on two major projects. One of the projects was the documentary that I hope you had a chance to see. When I turned over all the footage to the editors, it was in January of 2020. Little did I know that 2 months later, we would never be able to connect again in person. So all of the conversations we had about which edits to choose, which ones to leave out, occurred over Zoom, just like what we're doing now. And so they would send me a version and I would say, this is great, but change this. And then they send another version. I say, okay, this is good. You fixed that, but now let's fix this. And I do think in some ways, as horrible as the pandemic has been, it has forced many of us to stay inside. And so on the weekends, when I normally might, hang out with friends or do some things, I actually was working on the documentary. And so the silver lining in all of it is that the pandemic has actually helped me stay focused. It's helped me put my nose to the grindstone. And it's helped me to say, I want this done by a certain date. And if I want this done, I'm going to have to do the work. So besides that project, though, I was also working on a book. And the book is called Ladies Leading: The Black Women Who Control Television News. And I had been working on this book for almost 10 years. And so this was another project that I really wanted to wrap up. And so the pandemic gave me nothing to do on the weekend. And so therefore, I fill that time with working on these two major projects.
What inspired you to be a PhD in African American Studies?
So that's a really good question. One of the things, and when I was going to school, elementary school, I actually didn't like history that much. But once I became a journalist, I realized I was actually participating in the first draft of history. And so I decided that being at a university, it made sense to go ahead and get what they call the terminal degree, which is the PhD. And I didn't want to get it in journalism because I'd already worked as a journalist, but I knew I wanted the subject matter to be somehow related to the women who I had not actually interacted with as a reporter in the newsroom. So the African American Studies field covered all things from history to culture to the arts to politics. And so I thought it was a topic that was closely aligned when I thought about a lot of the stories that I had covered as a reporter having to do with social justice, social inequalities, and race. And so it really seemed like a natural fit for me. And also my advisor, the person I worked with, was a woman by the name of Darling Clark Hine. And she had been what we would call the godmother of the history of Black women in the United States. And so she was also at Northwestern. And so knowing that I really wanted to focus on Black women in news, particularly the women behind the scenes that you never get a chance to actually see, that match seemed really a perfect fit for my topic and also being able to work with her. So that's why PhD, and that's why African American Studies. The other thing is I wanted a raise. Let's just be honest, right? Money is important. And so I knew that one of the things that would give me more longevity and one of the ways I could get a raise was to actually do the PhD. And I never was absolutely sure that I was going to turn my research into a book, but the more I got into it, the more I thought, okay, you can't just leave this research, in a box someplace. You actually have to do something with it. And that's how the book came about.
How long have you been teaching in university, and what do you teach?
So I've been teaching there since 1993. So this is my 28th year teaching. So I'm coming up on 3 full decades. And I typically teach at the undergraduate level, but also at the graduate level. Those are people who are working on master's degrees. And most of the courses that I teach have to do with video storytelling. But occasionally I also teach courses that are subject related. So I took the documentary, for example, and I taught a mini doc class in the fall, I think it was fall of 2020. And one of the reasons it worked so well is because I had so much more footage than I could ever put in the documentary. And so what I did is I gave the students, 18 students, access to all that footage. and let them come up with their own mini version of what they thought was important in the footage. Again, I didn't give them everything because it would just be too overwhelming, but they came up with their own 6-minute mini docs. And they did a really good job, I thought, in terms of the perspectives that they had. They blended in a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement photographs that either their friends had taken or they had taken over the course of the summer. And they were able to really make some connections. So that was very gratifying seeing them do that.
How old were you first got started in broadcasting?
So how old was I when I first got started? So I would say I actually was 12 in 7th grade. And the reason why I give you that date 12 is because when I was an elementary school student at Ruggles Elementary School, which is at 78th and Prairie, we did this program at the Gifted Center, which was at Chicago State University. So I would take the bus in 7th grade and 8th grade from my house to 95th Street and King Drive. And there were kids from different elementary schools within that region who got a chance to go to this program. So every Friday, instead of going to our regular school, we would go there. And so they had us doing things like research papers, in 7th and 8th grade, and just doing things that we wouldn't have had a chance to do at our regular elementary school. And one of the projects that we had to do was a career development project. And so we had to get the occupational handbook. I remember it was this thick book. And we had to look in careers. And I thought, journalism, that seems interesting, but broadcast seems particularly interesting because I didn't know anybody in my family who had ever been a broadcaster before. And so one of the assignments that we had to do was actually call somebody and interview somebody who was doing the job that we wanted to do. And the person that I spoke to at the time was Edwina Moore, who was probably the first Black woman reporter at CBS 2 in Chicago. And she had actually been an English teacher before she moved into journalism. It's the first thing she told me to do is when you get to high school, join the school newspaper staff, because that's going to give you some experience with journalism. And so I did that. I participated in a summer journalism workshop that was called Youth Communication. I think that was between my freshman and sophomore year. And I got a chance to meet kids from all over the city who were also interested in journalism. And the rest is history. My husband always says, I don't know anybody who's known what they wanted to do since they were 12. You really are unique in that particular way, because most people are still trying to figure out what they really want to do when they grow up. And so teaching has just been a natural extension of that.
Me pass the mic to the Lois.
What is the hardest thing about teaching?
Well, that's easy. Grading. Grading is my nemesis. That means I have to evaluate. We do a lot of assignments for our students, and that means a lot of feedback. If you've ever written anything before, what's really important is for you to get feedback. It's not like math where there's a right or wrong answer, or even vocabulary where there's a right definition and a wrong definition. When people are writing, they put their heart and their soul into it. And so it's very emotional for you to pull all that information out of you. And it's even more emotional when somebody evaluates the writing and either says, this is good and this is not good. But I feel after teaching for so many years that it's extremely important for me to give honest feedback to students and not sugarcoat, not tell them they did a great job when they really didn't. Because I have high expectations and I want the students to rise to those expectations. And the only way they can do that is for me to give them lots of feedback and lots of practice and lots of opportunities to do it over again.
How long have you been teaching about and working on problems with racism?
So when I first came to Northwestern, I'd say for about the first decade, I pretty much just taught the straight journalism, but I was always interested in how journalists deal with race and racism, both as recipients of racism, but also how they cover racism. So it's really two-pronged. So, I think even when I worked in news organizations, I was always interested in how people were portrayed, in particular, people who looked like me. And was always asking those kinds of questions and saying, okay, what story should we cover? We don't want to perpetuate negative stereotypes because often people get their perceptions of who people are based on watching news, particularly television. And so I didn't want to be that reporter that perpetuated the stereotype. So I would say I was interested in it from the very beginning. I think now, though, we see a real increase and we see a new generation of journalists who, number one, were educated a little bit more about racism and how it manifests itself and the systems of racism. And so therefore, those people are now moving into the journalism field. I don't know if you all remember or heard, but when the protest took place in Minneapolis, there was a young Black man named Omar Jimenez. He's part Black, but part Hispanic, Latino as well. And so he was the one who was arrested from CNN as he was covering that story. He's a former student of mine. And so when he came to class in the summer to talk about that experience, one of the questions I asked him was, what was it like being a Black man, being a reporter? So he said one of the first things is that his mother, called him and said, I don't want you to be like another Black man who gets killed by the police. And so that layer of being able to ask those questions, I think is really, really important, because sometimes people are afraid to ask questions that they think might be a little touchy, or the person might think that they're being nosy. But as a journalist, you have the license to be nosy. You can ask those questions that people are really thinking about and wondering, all in the name of journalism.
Can you tell us a story about a time you have experienced racism?
So that's a good question. One of the times that I remember probably most was when I was covering a story in Tampa, Florida, and it was in the outskirts of Tampa. Well, two incidents that occurred. The first one, I was covering a story where there had been a murder, and the victim was a young white man, and the perpetrator was a young Black man. And so the father, I think, saw the murder as a racial issue, when in the end, the two of them had actually been friends and they knew each other. And so when I went to try to interview the father said, I'm not going to talk to you, send a white reporter. Okay. So in the moment, he was feeling as though all Black people were bad and he didn't want to talk to me. The other time that I remember experiencing, although I think this was divine intervention, it turned out I didn't have to experience, I was scheduled to cover a Ku Klux Klan rally it was near Sarasota, Florida. They were having some big protest or something there. But if you know anything about Florida, the weather, every afternoon it rains, and it rains really hard and pours. And so for that particular day, the photographer and I got there, and it was a torrential rain. It was a downpour, and they couldn't have the rally. So that was really interesting. I wondered, having read about the Ku Klux Klan, and this was probably in, like the 90s, actually, that they were actually having a rally in Florida. And so that was something I escaped, but that would have been, I think, very, very awkward for me.
Why you want to make the film Mandela in Chicago?
So I made the film because I started co-directing this program that we have at Northwestern called the South African Journalism Residency. And what students do, journalism students actually go to South Africa and they work there for an entire quarter as a journalist, as like a junior reporter. And so as part of that program, I teach a prep course that helps them get prepared for their time there. So it's a course about history, politics, music, culture. And my predecessors had started bringing in Chicagoans who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And as they started bringing in people here and there, like Funeka Shishali, who is a South African, but she's been living in Chicago for probably more than 30 years, they started telling me about other people. And so there was this snowball effect where before you knew it, I had interviewed 28 people who were involved in Chicago's Free South Africa movement. And so I like to say that one of my primary goals was to tell the story of Chicago's anti-apartheid movement, because Chicago doesn't get much shine, if you will, as it relates to the anti-apartheid movement. It's mostly New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, those other cities that historically have gotten a lot of attention. So I wanted Chicago, being a native Chicagoan, I wanted Chicago to get some shine. And I also wanted the people in the documentary to also get some shine, because they had never, in a group setting, actually talked about the work that they had done. And the sad part is that of all the people that I've interviewed, already 4 people have passed away. I just learned of another person last week who passed away in the documentary. So I knew it was important to get them on the record, to tell their story while they still could, because many of them were in their 70s and 80s by the time I actually interviewed them.
What does Black Lives Matter, does that have to do with the film?
I like to think of Chicago's anti-apartheid movement as sandwiched between the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, because it's really about how you organize, how you protest systems that you think are wrong, how you protest inequality. And so I think that there's a natural connection to what happened in Chicago back in the 80s and what we see now with the Black Lives Matter movement, because people are protesting, and it's a new generation of protesters who many of them weren't even born in the 1980s, but you can see some similarities. And when I talked to the people in the documentary about what they thought about the Black Lives Matter movement, most of them were just overjoyed to see younger people now. They were the younger people back then. Now they see a new generation getting involved and trying to right some of the wrongs of discrimination and racism.
Haven't made a film before. How did you learn to do it?
So I had never made a film before. This was my first time, but it was very similar to my work as a video broadcast journalist, because over time I made probably hundreds of short stories of, a minute 30, 3 minutes. Now this was 50 minutes. So obviously I had to spend a lot more time on it. That's why it took 4 years to actually put it together while I was doing all the other stuff that I was doing. I have colleagues who do documentaries. I had watched a lot of documentaries. I was also part of what's called DIVIT, the Diverse Voices in Documentary class through Cartemquin Films. And that program is really designed to try to get more people of color making films about people of color. And so that helped me just make connections with videographers, editors. But more importantly, some of the things that I didn't know was about the marketing of a documentary and how do you get it, on certain platforms. You have to have a lawyer look at every shot in the video to make sure you're not going to get sued by anyone. And so those kinds of things, they were very helpful in putting me in contact with people. But really, a lot of it was contacts I already had, or somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody. And so that's what you do as a journalist. You may not know the answer right away, but you call people, you email people, you say, I'm looking for blank. Can you help me? And you've always got to be asking questions. And that's the thing that I like about journalism, is you get to learn something new every day.
Now I pass the mic to Leo.
Hello, my name is Leonardo.
Hi, Leonardo. How are you?
I am doing good.
Good.
I have only 2 questions to ask. Here's my first question. What was the hardest part about doing the film?
I would say the hardest part about doing a film, and I think I would apply this to the book as well, is the editing process. You are never done until you're done. And so that first draft, turns into a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth. I mean, sometimes you do kind of get sick of it because you got to constantly go back to it, but you're trying to make it a little bit better. You're trying to make sure the sound quality is equal. You're trying to make sure that the graphics make sense. You're trying to make sure that all that historical footage that you have actually has the right colors in it. And so the editing process, I would say, is the hardest.
My second question is, what was the best thing about making the film?
I would say the reaction from people, especially people who felt like they had finally gotten a chance to tell their stories. So after this documentary aired on PBS on Channel 11 here locally, I had a gathering of people over Zoom where I shared the film with my South African friends. And so it was South Africans who were in the film, along with also some people stateside who were in the film. And they just seemed so appreciative of being able to share their story. And so that was, I would say, the most gratifying part.
Yes, definitely. And now I'm going to pass the mic to Frederick.
Hey, Ava, my name is Frederick As II.
Hi, Frederick. How are you?
I'm good. What advice do you have for us as the podcast from the journalist background?
So the most important thing for you as a podcaster is to do your research before you interview the person, because you want to be able to ask them questions that maybe nobody else has thought of. Yes, you got to ask the basic questions, but you also have to ask them questions that you wouldn't ask unless you actually did the research to know who they are. So that's the most important thing, is research beforehand.
Okay. Thank you. The next one is going back to Angel L.
If there's time, let's open up the rest of your producers, see if they had other questions.
I'll go first. My name is David. I have a question.
Go ahead, David.
What made you pick South Africa for the subject?
So remember, I was saying that I actually co-direct a program in South Africa. And because of that, I was starting to meet people who were coming to the class as visitors. And they told me about this person and that person. The other thing I would say, too, that was really important to me, in the documentary, there's that sign, Free South Africa, that's in front of Trinity United Church of Christ. We hear from Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who, if you remember during President Obama's election, there was a lot of controversy involving Reverend Jeremiah Wright. But I knew him from my time at Northwestern as an undergrad. I used to sing in the Northwestern Community Ensemble. And so I remember him coming to campus as one of the hosts because he's a musicologist. And so he really studies music and how it dovetails with a person's ethnicity. And so he's a very learned man. And I remember that sign when I was in high school, but I didn't really quite know what it meant, what it was about. And so one of the things that the topic gave me a chance to do was actually go and interview him and ask him, hey, what was that sign about? And as you heard the story that he told, that was a story that I never knew. That was one of those behind the scenes pieces of information that I thought was very interesting in the scheme of things. So I really hope that through the film, you've been able to see a little bit about the history of Chicago's role in trying to end apartheid, but most importantly, see the connections to yourself. Is that these were just people who thought it was important to speak up, to organize, to educate other people, and to learn themselves. And once they learned, then they took action. And that's really what the film is about, is taking action, whatever action you feel is most comfortable for you.
Yeah. Last time when I was actually watching the movie, when we used to talk about South Africa, it was like how the government is actually so corrupted. And also they was talking about South Africa, and what I said is we not even set up ourselves because they so cruel to South Africa, even though they don't have the resources South Africa does as well.
Yeah. So even today, even though obviously there's no more official apartheid, unofficial, separate, and unequal still exists, just like it does in Chicago, right? I mean, we know that there are great neighborhoods in Chicago and horrible neighborhoods in Chicago, right? We know that that exists. And we know that also tends to exist around race, right? Race and ethnicity, that the Black and brown neighborhoods struggle more than neighborhoods like Lakeview or along the Gold Coast in the city of Chicago. Same thing in South Africa. We went to a home the last time we were there in February 2020 that was fabulous. I mean, that was the most beautiful home I've ever seen. I mean, it would rival any Hollywood home. And this was in Johannesburg. But then there's certain sections of Johannesburg in the squatter camps and in the townships where they don't have running water and they don't have toilets. Just like you have an indoor toilet, they have to go outside to go to the bathroom. And if they want water, they've got to go outside and pump the water. They don't have electricity inside their homes. They're living in aluminum-made shacks, really. And it gets very hot, obviously, in the summertime. There's no electricity, so they can't have air conditioning. And of course, it can get very cold in the wintertime because South Africa, you know, their seasons are flipped from ours, or our seasons are flipped from theirs. So right now we're going into summer, they're going into fall. And so that's the part that's really unique, right? When you go there and the trees are just turning green here, but you go there in May, which that used to be the time that I would go in May, and in February, the trees are already changing colors and they're, you know, reds and yellows and things like that. So that's always fascinating. And when I go in February, it's winter time here and it's summertime there. So, but to your point about the corruption exists everywhere, right? It exists in South Africa. It exists here in Chicago. It exists here in Washington, D.C. And so I think what we should all take from this is that there's certain behaviors that are universal, good and bad behaviors. And so I think we want to be able to see other countries not as the other necessarily, but as what are the similarities that make us want some of the same things? We want to have safety. We want to have, a good job. We want to have a family. We want to have a good education. All those things are the same things that South Africans want as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
When making the film, what was the part of the film that was really heartbreaking or just hard to understand?
Well, I wouldn't call it heartbreaking, but it was one of those sections that blew my mind. I was unaware that enslaved African Americans had been traveling to South Africa on ships back in the 1800s. I was unaware that the Hampton Jubilee Singers, we've all probably heard of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, but the Hampton Jubilee Singers aren't quite as well known. I was amazed that they had been going to South Africa as late as the 1890s, and that missionaries, African American missionaries with the AME Church and other churches in the United States, had been traveling to South Africa that long. I had never known that before, never learned it in any history books or anything like that. But what's interesting, though, is that South Africans, they do know that history. They know that African Americans have been traveling. And they even have a festival in Cape Town that sort of celebrates African Americans who had been coming to that part of South Africa. So remember, Cape Town is right on the coast. And so it's right on the water. And so it makes sense, right, that these boats are coming from the United States and they're docking in Cape Town because that city was the closest to the water. Johannesburg is more inland, so it would have been harder for them to get there. So that's the part that really kind of blew my mind. But what made me sad was that I had never learned that history in school.
I have a question. How did Nelson Mandela get arrested?
How did he get arrested? Okay, so good question. So one of the things about a documentary is that you can never tell it all. And so the beauty about it is hopefully I'm piquing your interest. So just like you have this question here about how he got arrested, hopefully you will go and research that on your own. The short answer is that Nelson Mandela, as many Black South Africans experience, was arrested because he was organizing against apartheid. So imagine if Black Lives Matter folks who were organizing against discrimination, that just by doing that, not even going out to do the protest, but just organizing so that they can have a protest. Let's say somebody finds out that they're organizing. They tell the police says, there can't be any organizing. There can't be anything that's against the government. We're going to arrest you. Now, Nelson Mandela was arrested for a particular reason called treason. And you've probably heard that before with the January 6th takeover of the US government. And so he was arrested and at one time actually considered a terrorist because there was a plot to blow up some electrical grids in South Africa that he was involved in. And so that's what caused him to get arrested and to remain in jail for 27 years. A lot of the folks who, though, were arrested weren't kept that long, maybe for a year or two, then they were released. And also people like Oliver Tambo, and he's the person who preceded Nelson Mandela. He lived in exile. That means you have to leave your country and move to another country and stay there as long as possible, because the minute you set foot in your country, you're going to be arrested. That's why we ended up having so many South Africans in the Chicago area. Many of them came for educational purposes and just stayed. But some of them, like Dennis Brutus, he was a professor at Northwestern, and he was here living in exile. And there was some conversation about, well, should you go back to South Africa because that's your home? But he knew if he again would go back, he would be immediately arrested and thrown in jail. So some of the things that we take for granted today, like being able to organize and protest and First Amendment rights and things like that, those things were not common back then. And certainly they weren't common for Black people in the United States either. When you think about the Jim Crow era, when you think about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, when you think about the protests, in Selma, Alabama, where dogs and fire hoses were, forced on people as a way to get them not to protest. And so in South Africa, you had some of those similarities. And that's why I always say, I think there are a lot of similarities between U.S. apartheid and South African apartheid.
Thank you, Ava, for being on Power Our Story with us.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciate being able to speak about the documentary. I hope it elicits some questions, more questions than answers, and that you will go and seek some of those answers on your own.
Power Your Story podcast is produced by Chicago High School students with production support from Actor School Matters and the Creative Imposter Studio. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube at Power Your Story Podcast, and visit our website at poweryourstorypodcast.com. Thank you for listening.